April 1945. The war in Europe is dying, but not quietly. In a small Bavarian village, the air smells of smoke and rain. The roads are filled with mud, burned trucks, and faces that no longer believe in tomorrow. Down one of those roads walks a group of women, German Red Cross nurses, their white armbands stained with blood and ash. They had been ordered to stay behind, to tend to the wounded who would never return to the front. Now, their field hospital has fallen silent. American jeeps approach, engines growling through the mist. The nurses freeze. They have heard the stories, that the victors show no mercy, that captivity means degradation. One woman tightens her coat, bracing for what she believes will come. But when the soldiers stop, there are no shouts, no blows. Instead, an American sergeant steps forward. He lowers his weapon and offers water. The nurses exchange confused glances. No one speaks. One of them whispers, "Warum?" Why? In that single moment, everything they had been taught about the enemy begins to unravel. Because the war was ending, and with it came something even rarer than peace: human decency. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. The Reich that once promised a 1,000-year empire now barely held 1,000 square miles of ground. From the east, the Red Army stormed across Pomerania and Silesia. From the west, American, British, and French divisions poured across the Rhine. Every German city lay in ruins. Dresden burned, Cologne hollowed, Berlin already trembling under Soviet artillery. In this chaos, among the dying soldiers and displaced civilians, stood a quiet army in white, the nurses of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, the German Red Cross. Most were women in their 20s. Some had volunteered out of patriotism, others out of duty, and many simply because there was no one else left to care for the wounded. Their work spanned every corner of the collapsing front, from makeshift field hospitals near Aachen to underground bunkers in Hamburg, and even trains converted into mobile wards. They had seen more death than most soldiers. In the final months of the war, morphine ran out, bandages were scarce, and hospitals were bombed as often as troop columns. Many nurses stayed behind with the dying, not because they believed in victory, but because they could not abandon those who still breathed. The German army, desperate and paranoid, had ordered them to remain loyal to the Führer until the very end. SS patrols roamed the countryside, executing deserters and anyone suspected of surrendering without orders. Even nurses were not exempt. Captured female medics were often accused of cowardice before the enemy if they attempted to flee. When the Americans advanced into Western Germany, they moved with overwhelming force and organization. Behind the front lines came units of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, trained to handle not only the wounded, but also civilians and enemy prisoners. Among their ranks were doctors and nurses who had seen the horrors of Normandy and Bastogne, and who carried with them a set of values that had been reinforced through the Geneva Conventions. Unlike many nations in that war, the United States had committed to the fair treatment of enemy medical staff. According to international law, nurses wearing the Red Cross emblem were to be treated as non-combatants. They were to be protected, not punished, even if they had served under the Nazi regime. But for the German nurses, this was unthinkable. Propaganda had long told them that Allied troops were brutal, that surrender meant assault, humiliation, or worse. Posters in German hospitals warned, "Better to die faithful than to fall into enemy hands." And yet, as the front lines crumbled, those same hands extended food, medicine, and blankets. One U.S. medical officer, Captain Robert W. Dodd, recorded in his field journal near Kessel, "We found the women tending wounded German soldiers in a cellar. They refused to leave until the last man was carried out. When we offered them coffee, they looked as if we had handed them a miracle." Such scenes unfolded across the Western Front, in barns, cellars, and ruined churches turned into emergency wards. The German Red Cross nurses were often captured alongside the very soldiers they had treated. Some were escorted to American field hospitals, others to temporary internment centers. For many, it was their first encounter with the enemy, and it shattered everything they had been taught. Still, fear lingered. Behind their stoic expressions were memories of bombings that had erased entire cities, of brothers who never returned, of whispered tales about what the Soviets were doing in the East. To these women, the war had long ceased to be about nations. It had become a struggle to hold on to any sense of humanity in a world that seemed to have lost it. And yet, in the fields of Western Germany, amid wreckage and surrender, something unexpected emerged. Not vengeance, not hatred, but restraint, a quiet discipline from the soldiers of an army that had seen too much death to add more unnecessarily. This was the world the German nurses stepped into as they laid down their Red Cross satchels and raised their hands in surrender. A world in ruins, but not entirely without mercy.
When the Western Front disintegrated in March and April 1945, thousands of German medical personnel were swept into the tide of surrender. Entire hospital units, once stationed near the Rhine or the Ruhr, found themselves under American control within hours. The U.S. Army had learned through experience that war did not end when the fighting stopped. It continued in the form of wounds, starvation, and disease. So, as divisions advanced, medical and logistical branches followed immediately behind, bringing food, medicine, and discipline. Within this machinery of organized chaos, the treatment of German nurses stood out as a quiet but powerful act of principle. According to the 1943 revision of the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, enemy medical personnel were not to be treated as ordinary POWs. Instead, they were to be retained personnel, allowed to continue caring for the wounded, even if they themselves were in captivity. This legal distinction mattered. It meant that, technically, these German women were not prisoners, but professionals who still held a purpose. For many American officers, this was more than just paperwork. The U.S. Army Medical Department, hardened by the moral horrors of Nazi atrocities revealed in liberated camps, sought to demonstrate what a lawful, humane army should look like. Even in victory, there were lines that could not be crossed. Reports from captured German field hospitals near Würzburg and Bad Nauheim revealed the same pattern. When U.S. units entered, they confiscated weapons, gathered soldiers, and then instructed the German nurses to remain at their posts. The Americans provided food rations, fuel, and even medical supplies, ensuring that the German wounded under their care were treated. One American medic, Corporal James Hill of the 45th Infantry Division, later recalled, "They were terrified of us. One of the nurses kept saying, 'Bitte, nicht schlagen,' please don't hit. When we told them they could keep their patients, she started crying, not from fear, but from relief." The same tone appeared in numerous military field reports. The respect shown to German nurses was not an isolated gesture, but a consistent practice. It came from the top. General Dwight Eisenhower, then Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had emphasized strict adherence to military discipline in the treatment of civilians and prisoners. He understood that occupation would only succeed if it was grounded in moral order. His message to all troops was clear. We are not the enemy of the German people, only of their government. That message trickled down the chain of command and into the smallest encounters. A medic sharing a cigarette, a guard offering a blanket, a soldier opening a can of rations for a trembling nurse. In contrast, the situation in the East was brutal beyond words. Soviet forces, enraged by years of German atrocities on Russian soil, often responded with unrestrained vengeance. German nurses captured on the Eastern Front faced assault, imprisonment, or execution. Many chose suicide over surrender. This stark difference shaped post-war memory. For the nurses who fell into American hands, captivity was not comfort, but it was dignity, and that distinction would echo through their testimonies in later years. In the months after Germany's surrender, the U.S. established organized prisoner of war camps throughout occupied territory. These included medical compounds, where German doctors and nurses were allowed to continue treating their own wounded under Allied supervision. The Red Cross emblem, once a symbol of loyalty to the Reich, now became a bridge between enemies. The American guards, many of whom were barely older than the women they guarded, were often shocked by the conditions in which the German medical staff had been operating. No anesthesia, no electricity, no antibiotics. What they witnessed was not defiance, but exhaustion. A generation of women who had carried the moral burden of a dying nation. For the German nurses, what came next would redefine their understanding of war and humanity itself. They would discover that their captors, men they had been told to fear, would show them something their own system had long abandoned: respect. And that respect, quietly extended in the ashes of the Third Reich, would become one of the most overlooked yet profound chapters in the story of World War II's end.
The human angle. Fear meets dignity. For the German nurses, surrender was not just an act of defeat. It was the surrender of everything they had been taught about the world. Raised under 12 years of relentless Nazi propaganda, they believed that the enemy was savage, that capture would mean violation or death. When the first American soldiers entered their hospitals, the nurses braced for humiliation. Instead, they found discipline. The U.S. soldiers were young, farm boys from Iowa, clerks from Chicago, teachers from New England, men who had seen horror in Normandy and Bastogne, but had not lost their humanity. They moved methodically, checking rooms, collecting weapons, then standing guard at a distance. One German nurse, later interviewed by a Red Cross official, said quietly, "We expected the end of the world. Instead, they treated us as nurses, not enemies." It was a small miracle in a season of ruin. These women had spent months tending to men whose bodies were shattered and whose cause was collapsing. Their last sense of order came from their profession, the duty to heal. When the Americans allowed them to continue that work, it gave them something priceless: purpose. The soldiers, too, seemed changed by it. They were no longer conquerors in those wards. They were fellow witnesses to the cost of war.
One medic described seeing a German nurse wrap the hand of a dying prisoner and whisper a prayer. He wrote in his notebook, "I didn't know the enemy could cry for us." In a world consumed by vengeance, those quiet rooms of care became acts of moral rebellion. Humanity survived, not in speeches, but in gestures as small as sharing water, holding a hand, or refusing to see the other as less than human. The tactical angle, the strategic value of compassion. There was also calculation behind the compassion. The U.S. Army understood that winning wars was not just about destroying the enemy's armies, it was about stabilizing the aftermath. The Allied leadership had learned hard lessons from the First World War. In 1918, the harsh treatment of German prisoners and civilians had bred resentment that later fueled Nazism. In 1945, the Americans were determined not to repeat that mistake. Every act of discipline and mercy was part of a larger mission, to occupy without becoming oppressors. The treatment of German medical staff fell squarely within this doctrine. Allowing nurses to continue working served both humanitarian and tactical goals. It reduced the number of wounded that American medics needed to treat, and it kept order in newly captured zones. German civilians, seeing their nurses unharmed, were more likely to cooperate and less likely to resist occupation. Colonel Frank D. Dwyer, a senior officer in the U.S. Army Medical Department, wrote in an internal report from April 1945, "We find it expedient and morally sound to allow enemy medical personnel to maintain their duties. Their cooperation reduces local unrest and upholds the image of the American soldier as a liberator, not an executioner." That image mattered deeply to U.S. command. America's victory was not just military, it was ideological. It was a war fought to prove that democracy, law, and decency could defeat tyranny and hate. Every fair act toward the defeated was a statement to the watching world. On the ground, however, it was often simpler. The GIs who entered abandoned hospitals were exhausted and scarred. They had seen civilians burned in Dresden, children buried in rubble, soldiers who refused to surrender. Showing mercy wasn't about politics, it was about survival of the conscience. Many of the American guards at these facilities would later write home about the experience. Letters recovered from the National Archives include lines like, "We found German nurses who hadn't eaten in 3 days. We gave them our rations. They cried. They thought we'd kill them, but we just told them to keep doing their job." These moments, though small, were critical. They prevented chaos, saved lives, and demonstrated to the civilian population that the American Army came not as executioners, but as enforcers of peace. What neither side fully realized then was how these gestures, born of discipline and exhaustion, would ripple through post-war Germany. They would shape how the defeated saw their conquerors, and how the world began to rebuild trust after the most destructive war in history. In those silent hospital corridors, amid the smell of antiseptic and gunpowder, compassion became a form of control, not through fear, but through respect. And respect, once given, began to dismantle the last remnants of Nazi delusion.
The leadership and moral angle, Eisenhower's code of conduct. Behind the calm discipline shown by American soldiers was something larger, a moral strategy built into the chain of command. By 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made one thing unmistakably clear: the Allies were to win the war without losing their soul. He understood the dangerous temptation that came with victory. Armies that marched through destroyed cities could easily turn brutal, and Eisenhower had seen what unrestrained revenge looked like in Europe, in Asia, and even among other Allied forces. To him, victory without humanity was a hollow triumph. His directives were firm. German civilians, prisoners, and especially medical personnel were to be treated with respect under international law. Allied soldiers were warned that any act of abuse would not only dishonor the uniform, but would also betray the very ideals they were fighting to defend. This moral restraint was not naive idealism, it was a deliberate act of leadership. Eisenhower knew that the way the United States treated its defeated enemies would define America's moral authority in the post-war world. The orders trickled down through the corps and divisions, finding their way to field hospitals and makeshift detention sites. And in those small, isolated places, a captured clinic, a Red Cross station, a ruined school turned infirmary, young American guards carried out that code. For the nurses, it was almost impossible to believe. They had grown up hearing that American soldiers were monsters, corrupt, violent, barbaric. Instead, they encountered politeness, restraint, and even apologies. It shook the very foundation of their worldview.
Some American officers went further, reminding their men that these women were professionals, not combatants. "You are not here to avenge," one captain reportedly told his unit. "You are here to prove we are better than what we fought." It worked. Across countless encounters, that principle, quiet, unrecorded, uncelebrated, preserved a sense of decency amid ruin. And in doing so, it drew a moral line in history, proof that even after total war, civilization could still choose to act like one. The psychological angle, healing after hate. The emotional transformation of the German nurses did not happen instantly. At first, fear ruled everything. When American guards offered them food or medicine, many refused, suspecting poison. When told they were free to rest, they stayed awake, convinced that kindness was a trick. But over days and weeks, the reality became undeniable. The Americans treated them not as symbols of Nazism, but as human beings caught in its machinery. A nurse named Annalisa Kerner, who had served near Frankfurt, wrote in her post-war diary, "They guarded us with rifles, yes, but never raised them in anger. When they said we were safe, I believed them only when I saw the wounded prisoners being carried with care. They treated our men and theirs the same." For many of these women, the war had blurred every boundary between right and wrong. They had seen atrocities committed by their own soldiers, had treated victims of air raids and massacres, and had lived under constant indoctrination. The Americans' behavior forced a reckoning. If the enemy could be merciful, what did that say about everything they had believed? Psychologists who later studied post-war German prisoners noted this phenomenon repeatedly. For some, it became the first step towards confronting the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. Being treated humanely by the supposed enemy shattered years of conditioning. For the Americans, too, it left a mark. Guarding the defeated required restraint in the face of unimaginable provocation, the memory of fallen comrades, of concentration camps just uncovered. Yet many soldiers later described a strange peace that came from refusing vengeance. Compassion became a form of victory, not of domination, but of conscience. One sergeant stationed in Bavaria later told a war correspondent, "After Dachau, I wanted revenge. But then I saw those nurses treating our wounded boys. I realized they weren't the ones who built the camps. They were just trying to save whoever they could." That realization, repeated thousands of times in small, quiet moments, became a psychological bridge between two broken nations. The nurses began to see the Americans not as occupiers, but as protectors. The Americans, in turn, saw the defeated not as monsters, but as people in need of rebuilding. The cultural contrast. Two worlds collide. The contrast between German and American wartime culture could not have been sharper. The nurses had lived under a regime that glorified obedience, hierarchy, and the erasure of individuality. They were taught that compassion was secondary to duty, that mercy was weakness. The Americans came from a culture where individuality was prized, where soldiers carried photos of families in their pockets, and where decency was seen as strength. When these two worlds met, the collision was profound. In one captured hospital near Stuttgart, an American lieutenant reportedly remarked, "You Germans build machines like gods, but treat people like parts." To the German nurses, his words were unsettlingly true. They had seen their hospitals run like factories, patients as numbers, care dictated by ideology, not need. Now the Americans were showing them another way, that medicine could exist beyond propaganda, that healing itself was an act of freedom. Many of these women would later credit that encounter, those weeks or months under American guard, as the beginning of their own moral awakening. They began writing letters, volunteering for post-war humanitarian work, and some even joined international Red Cross efforts under Allied sponsorship. The respect they received did not erase the past, but it gave them a chance to believe that the future could be different. And in those shattered hospitals of 1945, amid bandages and rubble, that belief was the first fragile seed of reconciliation between two former enemies. The final illusions of hate were crumbling, but history would soon reach its most revealing point, when these acts of unexpected decency turned into something larger, something unforgettable.
April 27, 1945, 3 days before Hitler's death. In the rolling hills of Hesse, west of Frankfurt, the war was almost over, but no one dared believe it. Smoke rose from the valleys where German anti-aircraft crews had made their final stand. Roads were crowded with refugees, wounded soldiers, and nurses still wearing their Red Cross armbands. Among them was the field hospital at Bad Nauheim, a spa town once known for its healing springs. Now the elegant resort halls had become makeshift wards. Beds filled every corridor, each one occupied by the shattered remains of a lost army. Boys of 16, men of 50, amputees, burn victims. The nurses, led by Sister Gertrude Weber, had not slept in 3 days. They had no anesthesia, no electricity, and almost no hope. That morning, a low rumble rolled through the town. The nurses froze. Outside, American jeeps and armored cars appeared, olive-drab shadows moving through the mist. The white star on their hulls glowed faintly through the smoke. For the Germans inside, it felt like the end of the world. Gertrude gathered her staff and whispered, "No one runs. We stay with the wounded." The doors burst open. 2 U.S. soldiers entered first, rifles raised, then paused. The sight before them was not a fortress, but a hospital filled with silent suffering. Dozens of German soldiers lay motionless, attended by women in blood-stained aprons. Lieutenant James Cartwright, the unit commander, later described it in his after-action report. "They stood there, hands shaking, waiting for us to shout. Instead, we told them to keep doing their work. I told my men, no weapons, no trouble. These are nurses, not Nazis." The Americans quickly established control, securing weapons, posting guards, and checking the wounded. But instead of evacuating or arresting the nurses, they did something unexpected. They helped. They unloaded stretchers, carried patients, and distributed medical rations. Within hours, American medics were assisting German nurses side by side. A Red Cross interpreter present that day recorded the moment in her diary. One of the German nurses started crying as an American soldier held a wounded man for her to dress his bandage. She said, "I don't understand. We are the enemy." He answered, "Not anymore, ma'am." That phrase echoed through the halls. Not anymore. For the women who had spent years under Nazi control, treated as expendable tools of the regime, that simple act of recognition felt impossible. They were not spat on, they were not insulted, they were respected. Outside, the war still thundered, but inside the hospital, an extraordinary calm settled in. The Americans had turned occupation into cooperation. German nurses served food to both American wounded and German POWs. A medic handed a bar of chocolate to a nurse who hadn't eaten in days. She broke it in half and shared it with her patient. That night, under candlelight, Sister Gertrude wrote in her notebook, "They came as our conquerors, yet they spoke to us with kindness. We did not know such men existed." Elsewhere across Western Germany, similar moments unfolded. In Würzburg, Stuttgart, and Kassel, captured field hospitals were reorganized under American oversight. Reports from U.S. Army Medical Corps officers show consistent directives: do not harm medical personnel, respect their service, provide rations equally. The result was stunning. Within weeks, the chaos of surrender turned into an organized network of Allied supervised hospitals. The Germans worked under American protection, caring for their own wounded and even assisting in treating Allied POWs who had been found starving in Nazi camps. This was the turning point. The defeated began to see their conquerors not as avengers, but as guardians of order. And for many American soldiers, witnessing the devotion of those German nurses, women who had refused to abandon their patients even as their nation collapsed, softened their anger. It reminded them that not every uniform represented the ideology they had fought against. Private Harold Benson of the 4th Infantry Division later told a journalist, "When we entered that hospital, I realized we weren't fighting people anymore. We were fighting what war had done to people." That realization, that human decency could outlast hatred, became one of the most powerful, if quiet, victories of the final days of World War II. As the guns fell silent across Germany, the story of those encounters between frightened nurses and disciplined soldiers spread through villages like a whispered truth, that mercy had survived the war. But this fragile understanding would soon be tested as the full scale of Nazi crimes came to light, and American troops faced the moral weight of what they had conquered. 2 days later, April 29, 1945, a gray dawn crept over Bavaria. The 45th Infantry Division was advancing toward Dachau, a name that at the time meant nothing to the soldiers who had spent months slogging through France and the Rhineland. But by noon that day, it would become synonymous with horror. The men expected another German stronghold, perhaps a small garrison, maybe even an ambush. Instead, what they found changed them forever. The gates of Dachau concentration camp stood open, the barbed wire sagging like the body of a dying beast. Inside lay thousands of corpses, stacked, twisted, unrecognizable. Survivors stumbled forward in striped uniforms, eyes sunken, arms outstretched. The smell hit the soldiers first, then the silence. Private William Quinn, one of the first through the gates, wrote in his report, "It was beyond anything we could imagine. The dead were piled like logs, the living were barely distinguishable. No battle could prepare a man for this." Nearby, American medics fell to their knees. These were the same men who, days earlier, had tended to German wounded in Bad Nauheim. Now they faced the other side of the war, the human cost of the ideology those same Germans had served. The soldiers moved through the camp in stunned disbelief. One of them, Sergeant Leon Bass, an African-American soldier from Pennsylvania, later recalled, "I looked into the eyes of those people and saw hell, and then I looked at the guards we captured and saw nothing." In one section of the camp, a group of German SS guards had been cornered and disarmed. The rage that erupted among the Americans was uncontrollable. Some soldiers opened fire, others turned away in disgust. The war's moral compass had shattered in the face of atrocity. Yet amid the chaos, one figure stood still. Captain John Dolan, a medic who had spent the previous week coordinating hospital relief in Hesse. He shouted at his men to stop. His words cut through the noise. "You can't fight monsters by becoming one." Those words carried weight, not because they excused what had happened, but because they reminded everyone what they were fighting for. That day, Dolan and his team turned their fury into action. They set up triage tents, cleaned wounds, handed out food, and disinfected barracks. They called for German nurses from nearby villages, women like Sister Gertrude, to help. And they came. When the first German nurses entered Dachau, they froze. Many dropped to their knees, weeping. Others covered their faces in shame. For years, they had been told that the camps were labor facilities. What they saw were open graves. One nurse reportedly whispered to an American doctor, "We were told this was for the fatherland, but this is not Germany. This is hell." Under the supervision of U.S. medics, the German nurses began cleaning the camp. They bathed survivors, burned infected clothing, and carried bodies to makeshift burial pits. Some of them collapsed from exhaustion or guilt, yet they continued. For the first time, both sides, victors and defeated, worked side by side in the ruins of humanity's darkest creation. An Associated Press correspondent who arrived at the scene later wrote, "There were no nations, no sides, only faces. Men and women moving among the dead, trying to bring back the living." That cooperation was not born of friendship, it was born of necessity, and of a shared understanding that what lay before them could never happen again. When news of Dachau reached the Allied command, General Eisenhower ordered full documentation of every camp discovered. He insisted that both soldiers and civilians, even local German townspeople, be brought to see it. His words were firm. "Get it all on record now. Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will say this never happened." In the days that followed, Americans began escorting German nurses and civilians into camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. Many fainted. Others stood silently, their faces drained of color. They were not being punished, they were being confronted. And in that confrontation, a strange thing occurred. The seeds of redemption were planted. The same American units that liberated concentration camps began establishing joint medical teams, German nurses under American command, to treat survivors and contain typhus outbreaks. The same hands that once bandaged Nazi soldiers were now saving victims of Nazi brutality. It was as if history itself demanded balance. One U.S. medic, Sergeant Frank Manning, summed it up in a letter home. "I saw German nurses feeding survivors who could barely lift a spoon. I don't know what to make of it, but maybe this is how a country starts to atone, one life at a time." By the end of April 1945, the war was still raging in Berlin. But across Western Germany, the front lines were no longer drawn by guns. They were drawn between those who chose vengeance and those who chose humanity. And in that moment, America's greatest victory wasn't military, it was moral.
May 8, 1945. The guns fell silent. The Third Reich, once a symbol of arrogance, power, and brutality, had crumbled into ash. Across Europe, church bells rang, soldiers wept, and civilians dared to exhale for the first time in 6 years. But in Germany, silence did not mean peace, it meant reckoning. The surrender was unconditional. The Allies now occupied a nation broken in body and spirit. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden were flattened to rubble. Their cathedrals reduced to shells, their streets littered with the remnants of a lost generation. Among the ruins walked millions of displaced people, former soldiers, widows, orphans, and refugees. And among them, the German nurses who had served faithfully through the chaos. They wore white uniforms in a country painted gray. For many of them, the war ended not in victory or death, but in captivity. As the U.S. Army advanced deeper into Germany, it encountered hundreds of field hospitals, medical shelters, and Red Cross outposts still staffed by German women. Most were arrested, questioned, and confined to civilian internment camps, a process designed not as punishment, but as precaution. Yet what happened next astonished everyone involved. At Camp Aschken, Bad Nauheim, and other temporary holding facilities, U.S. guards began treating German nurses and medical staff with respect, a gesture that contradicted the propaganda both sides had lived under for years. The women were issued clean clothes, fed, and allowed to keep personal items. They were not beaten, not humiliated. Many were stunned. Some cried quietly when handed soap and fresh water. Corporal James Benson, a 25-year-old American from Illinois, recalled in his diary, "They looked terrified when we brought them in, but when we offered them coffee, they didn't understand. One of them, a nurse maybe 25 or 26, asked if it was a trick. We told her no, the war is over." To those women, it felt impossible. They had been raised under the belief that surrender to Americans meant dishonor, that Allied troops would seek revenge. Instead, they found decency. At one camp near Marburg, U.S. guards even arranged small medical stations so the nurses could continue caring for wounded civilians. They treated German children suffering from burns and infections, and even helped with American field patients. The guards began to notice something remarkable: discipline, cleanliness, and compassion. Even in captivity, the German nurses worked tirelessly, keeping records, organizing supplies, and maintaining order among chaos. One American officer, Lieutenant Harold Green, later testified, "They never complained, never asked for special treatment. Some cried at night, others prayed, but in the daytime, they worked like it was still their duty. Only now, their patients weren't soldiers, but human beings." That quiet transformation was happening all across occupied Germany. The women who once served a regime of conquest were now tending to its victims. But the respect shown by U.S. guards didn't erase the past. It illuminated the possibility of something new. For every act of mercy, there was also memory. The memory of bombings, of camps, of unimaginable loss. Still, in small acts, a cup of water, a shared cigarette, a folded blanket, something began to thaw between former enemies. The Americans, many barely older than the nurses they guarded, started to realize that these women had lived through the same war, just on the other side of its madness. Some had treated soldiers dying for a cause they didn't believe in. Others had lost brothers and fathers in battles the regime glorified. And now, standing in a camp surrounded by barbed wire, they were finally free to simply be human again. For the first time, the war no longer felt like us versus them. It felt like everyone versus what war itself had done to the world. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the U.S. military administration began what they called the reconstruction of moral order. It wasn't just about rebuilding bridges and cities, it was about rebuilding people. And for many German nurses, that meant rediscovering what their uniforms were meant to represent in the first place: compassion, not obedience. At civilian internment camp number 91 near Kassel, hundreds of German nurses were still under Allied supervision. The war had ended, but the emotional wreckage had not. Many lived in a quiet state of disbelief, grateful to be alive, uncertain of what would come next. When American officers visited the camp, they found a strange calm. Barracks were clean, beds were neatly aligned, the infirmary was spotless. The German nurses had organized everything themselves, a gesture of dignity, perhaps also atonement. Captain Robert Hill, a medical officer stationed there, later wrote in his report, "They carried themselves like professionals, not prisoners. One nurse told me, 'We serve Germany, now we serve humanity.' It struck me that she meant it." The guards noticed too. At first they were distant, following strict protocol, but gradually walls began to lower. They shared meals, traded words in broken English and German, even exchanged photographs of families lost to the war. Some of the most unlikely friendships were formed in those months. An American medic who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge found himself talking every evening with a German nurse whose brother had died on that same front. Neither sought forgiveness, both sought understanding. These were small, quiet moments, far from the cameras, far from the triumphal parades in Paris or London, but they were the real beginning of Europe's healing. Across occupied Germany, the U.S. Army initiated medical collaboration programs. German nurses and doctors were gradually re-employed under Allied supervision to assist with refugee health crises, epidemic control, and hospital rehabilitation. In Munich, Frankfurt, and Wiesbaden, American medical officers trained German staff in modern procedures, blood transfusion methods, antiseptic protocols, and trauma management. In return, the German nurses brought discipline, organization, and a calm efficiency honed through years of war. The cooperation produced something neither side expected: mutual respect. A Red Cross liaison in 1946 reported, "American soldiers and German nurses worked together with remarkable spirit. The war seems to vanish in the wards. You can hear laughter again, hesitant but real." The transformation was not without pain. Some German nurses were questioned during denazification tribunals. A few were found complicit in wartime experiments or forced sterilizations. Others were cleared, but carried guilt that no verdict could erase. For many, the true punishment was remembering and living among ruins that mirrored their conscience. Still, the mercy shown by U.S. guards left a permanent mark. It contradicted years of propaganda and taught an entire generation of Germans that dignity could survive even in defeat. That lesson spread quietly through post-war Germany's hospitals, schools, and relief centers. By 1947, many of those same nurses were working for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, caring for displaced persons, Holocaust survivors, and war orphans. They wore the same white aprons, but now under a different flag, serving no Führer, no Reich, only humanity. In one of his later lectures, an American chaplain who had served in Hesse said, "I saw nurses who had once saluted the swastika kneel to feed children from countries their soldiers destroyed. That is not weakness, that is redemption in its purest form." The story of how German nurses were treated by their U.S. captors became one of the lesser-known human miracles of the post-war era, a reminder that victory is measured not only in battles won, but in the mercy shown afterward. For the Americans, it affirmed the very values they fought for: liberty, decency, justice. For the Germans, it offered a path back to humanity, not through pride, but through humility. And for both, it proved something larger than any flag or border could hold, that even in the ashes of total war, respect could rebuild what hatred had destroyed. The guns were gone, the uniforms had changed, but in the quiet of hospital wards, in the exchange of a glance between guard and nurse, something eternal had returned: the fragile peace of understanding. History often remembers the roar of guns, the flags raised, the surrender signed, but the true measure of victory is rarely found in parades or treaties. It is found in moments of mercy, in the simple act of choosing compassion when the world expects vengeance. The story of the German nurses and their American guards is not one of grand battles or famous generals. It is a story of quiet decency, the kind that rebuilds nations when empires fall. When those women first walked into Allied captivity, they carried more than bandages and memories. They carried the weight of a shattered identity. For years, they had served under a flag that promised greatness but delivered ruin. And yet when defeat came, it was not the Allied army's power that changed them, it was their restraint. The Americans who guarded them had seen war's worst: burning villages, mass graves, the frozen dead of the Ardennes. They had every reason to hate. Instead, they chose humanity. A cup of coffee offered to a frightened nurse, a shared cigarette in the rain, a patient tone where anger might have sufficed. Those gestures didn't erase the past, but they reshaped the future. They showed that decency, even in the ruins of war, is not weakness, it is strength. From those internment camps and makeshift hospitals came something deeper than surrender: reconciliation. The German nurses, once agents of a regime that preached division, became instruments of care in a world desperate for healing. Their hands, the same hands that had treated soldiers of the Wehrmacht, now saved the lives of Allied children, refugees, and survivors. It was proof that compassion can survive indoctrination, that even after the collapse of civilization, the human heart can choose to rebuild. In the silence after war, when the propaganda fades and the uniforms are gone, all that remains is what one person does for another. That is the real history, the one that doesn't make headlines but keeps humanity alive. So when the nurses of Germany looked at their American guards and said, "We did not expect to be treated with respect," they weren't just describing an act of kindness. They were describing the rebirth of civilization itself.